Welcome back. I was interviewed on a popular radio show in Chicago the other day. And while I can't remember exactly how we got there, I ended up expressing some of my views on gasoline and digital currencies, believe it or not. And it basically came down to the simple fact to me that gasoline and good old-fashioned cash both represent freedom to me. Nobody can shut down my cash in my wallet, and no dealership can turn off my car if they don't like where I'm driving. And with the Biden administration thinking about handing over our pandemic protocols to the WHO, it's been debated. And if that's actually what is happening, I say it's even scary that we're flying anywhere near that sun, right? That subject should be a no-go. But my next guest has a podcast and recently addressed some of these issues in a series named Globalization and the Totalitarian Control of Humanity. And we think this is right down our alley, and asked her to come on and give us her thoughts, condensed, obviously, into a 6-minute segment. But please welcome to the show, Rebecca Walser. Thanks for coming on, Rebecca. Great stuff. Ashley, the producer, heard it all. I got some bits and bobs, but I think you'd agree with me that cash is freedom, gasoline is freedom.
Amen. Amen. I mean, this was probably the biggest academic piece of work outside of, actual school and academia that I've ever done, Scott. It took me down a rabbit hole. As a lawyer, I was really bothered by the fact that these protocols that were to deal with coronavirus, these medical protocols, were passed under what we call EUA, which is Emergency Use Authorization, because basically what that requires, because EUA, meaning we have a medical emergency situation, we don't have time for the series of years of testing with controlled, populations to understand what would happen. So they push things fast quickly because we have an emergency. And what that requires legally is something called informed consent. And so when you have something that's an EUA product, you usually have to have the patient signing an informed consent. And what I couldn't reconcile as an attorney since 2020 is how can we have an EUA product that is being forced through mandates? Because that's not possible. You can't mandate somebody give informed consent that waives all of their risks and rights, even up and including their death. So I had a really hard time reconciling these. And so I started going down this rabbit hole. And, you and I have talked multiple times about central bank digital currencies and them moving us into this technical control grid. And we've gone through that, but we have never really gone into the area of healthcare other than when I brought to the show, and you and I have discussed multiple times, the WHO, and last year how they were really trying to change their international health regulations from 2005. Yes. It didn't get through last year. We got some momentum about the information, and they're meeting right now, their second meeting to pass these new regulations. But what I found, which is just absolutely terrifying, and the American public need and have a right to know, is that systematically starting in 1969 with the Chemical and Biological Warfare Act and going all the way through present day, we have had at least 20 iterations of laws that have been passed that have taken away under the auspices of a medical emergency, a public health emergency. And there's a specific term of art called a public health emergency of international concern. And that is where the WHO would get involved. But if we just look at America, this has been domesticated to the United States. And we are in such a situation now that in my podcast, Crashes and Taxes, released today, I take an hour and a half and I show both the laws and the regulations on the podcast that let you know that through the Department of Defense and the Department of Health and Human Services, there are laws now that say three things. Number one, the Department of Defense can issue medical protocols that bypass all testing and don't go through normal efficacy standards, and they don't have to meet efficacy standards. Number two, informed consent no longer has to be required to require these medical protocols. And number three, the federal government basically has the right to quarantine us and isolate us in camps or whatever, however they do it, with or without any understanding that we are actually infected, a disease carrier, or we're traveling interstate lines. I mean, basically it says if we reasonably believe that you have something and we believe that you'll come into contact with someone who may be traveling interstate lines, we can quarantine and isolate you indefinitely. So this is the absolute loss, 100% of medical protections. And all these lawsuits that everyone doesn't understand, why are these things not going forward? forward. And I will just quickly say one last thing. There was a lawsuit, we call it a key time lawsuit, which is basically a whistleblower lawsuit, where somebody who has been for 25 years in medical protocol testing was working as a subcontractor of one of the big makers of one of these medical products. And they basically sued. It was a False Claims Act suit and said the government did not follow the proper protocols. This was not correct. In fact, it was called fraudulent, the False Claims Act case. And the medical manufacturer basically came back and said, we did not follow those protocols because we did not have to, because this falls under the Other Transactions Authority of the law, which is a protocol that the Department of Defense basically contracted us to make for them. And therefore, we did not have any efficacy or safety protocols that we had to follow at all.
Okay. Well, it seems like you just described China to me. I mean, that's where we're at. I mean, how do we fight back? If can we? What do we do? What do the viewers do? I mean, if they're here, I feel sick to my stomach. What should we do?
So what is happening right now is the laws have been domesticated in the United States to militarize our healthcare, it's the militarization of our healthcare. And if you militarize our currency through central bank digital currencies, and you militarize our healthcare, and we have no choices anymore on anything, and there's no safety standards that need to be met, then this is over. Our democracy is false. There is no more freedom. There's no more regard for humanity at all, Scott. And so what we have to do is we have to say no to these WHO amendments. They have to be absolutely voted down. But we have to remember that we are a republic, and we're a republic that is a federalism republic, meaning we have the 10th Amendment to the Constitution that reserves to the states anything that is not specifically given as powers in the Constitution to the federal government. Health and police powers have always been reserved to the states. The state of Wyoming right now is in the process of passing legislation that says no to the federal healthcare system and no to the WHO and the international outsourcing of our healthcare system.
Wow.
What will happen? And that would work, but here's the problem. What is going to happen is exactly what happened during the pandemic, when block grants of federal money were going to school districts, and all these parents showed up at all these school board meetings and said, hey, what's going on? We have these glass shields, we have these 6 feet apart, we have these masking, and none of this makes any sense because we can see that this doesn't help anything.
Right.
And guess what? The school boards wouldn't hear it because they accepted federal block grant money for coronavirus with specific parameters that they had to follow A through Z on what to do. So when states start to push back, which they have the absolute legal authority to do under the law, under the Constitution, what will happen is that federal government will retaliate by saying no more Medicare funding, no more Medicaid funding,
Wow.
no more. They will start cutting the federal aid. And that is the problem that we have. And yet, Scott, we are no longer a democracy under this system of laws as they currently stand. So there's no choice. We must fight. We must fight back.
I'm going to fight with you. I'm going to bring it to the people because, boy, oh boy, it started with ESG and now you've just blown my mind. So I really appreciate you coming on. I'm going to look into it more myself. I'll definitely take a look at your podcast, but I really appreciate